Talk to Solomon.
Welcome to Talk to Solomon. Thanks so much for joining us. My Associate Police Chief Steve Davis is here tonight, as well as Dr. Alan Keyes. Chief Davis, if someone were to apply for a position with your police department, would they have to prove they are who they say they are? Would they have to show a birth certificate, give a valid Social Security number, those type of things?
Absolutely.
Can you imagine or give me the logic where a person can become president of the United States and they have an obviously phony Social Security number issued only to people in Connecticut at a time different than when the president was born, and no birth certificate that they are willing to show, only something that anyone could get and anyone could create that has no signature and no validity? Could you explain that to me?
No, and as an American, as an adult American, I'm surprised that since it's the law that the president has to be an American citizen, that part of the process of applying to be the president or putting together your campaign information doesn't require that to be filed.
You must be a natural-born citizen of the United States of America, and if I understand that correctly, that means both your mother and your father are American citizens, and you were born in the United States of America or on American soil, which would be a diplomat's home, an ambassador's residence, a military installation, a military ship, or that type of thing. Am I correct, Dr. Keyes?
Well, I would have to say, Stan, I think that some of the things that you just said are precisely the issues that need to be addressed, and it's one of the things that has appalled me, that the courts, and the Supreme Court in particular, has been so derelict. They swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. A question is raised that puts squarely on the table issues that involve, what does it mean to say that you're a natural-born citizen? And some folks have argued it requires the two-parent. Some folks are willing to say if you're born in the United States, that's been kind of a view we've followed, and granting citizenship to anchor babies and folks like this. Some folks understand that that phrase, natural-born, refers to a standard of nature that requires that we think through how traits are transmitted in the natural way, which is from parents to children, as we very well know. And then there's the question of whether the parents must be treated equally, whether you can favor the father over the mother, as has been done in the tradition of some countries, whether both parents have to be citizens, or whether, as seems to be the case in the way nature transmits traits, those traits are transmitted from one parent or another in certain circumstances. So all those are questions, though, Stan. I am not sure I am wise enough to figure out the answers to them, but I do know one thing. I don't have the authority to speak about that under the U.S. Constitution. But there are folks who do, and who therefore have the obligation and responsibility to resolve those questions in a way that then bears authority and can be respected equally by everyone who's going to be part of the presidential process. Instead, what did we get? You got bunches of people, Republicans, Democrats, didn't matter who, a whole bunch of cowardly people who obviously have no real respect for the Constitution, don't care whether its authority is undermined, who wrote letters to people, including Republicans, saying, well, the people decided in an election, and therefore that language in the Constitution doesn't matter. That's settled. That's over with. As if you can amend the Constitution by the whim of a majority, which, by the way, Stan, would defeat the stated purpose of having a Constitution. Since the founders were very clear that one of the great problems of government they wanted to resolve was the fact that whether it was the few, whether it was the military types, whether it was despots and absolute monarchs, or whether it was a Democrat majority, all through human history, whoever got power tended to use it without constraint. And that led to the abuse and oppression of human beings in an unjust way. And therefore, they looked the majority in the eye and said, you too must respect the basic premises of right as determined by God Almighty. And we're putting together a constitution that will require that you do so. So the people also, when they go to the voting booth, when they have majorities, they still must respect the terms of the Constitution of the United States. And it appalled me when people who are supposed to be leaders in this country started spreading an understanding that would validate the rightness somehow of treating as meaningless or non-existent a provision of the Constitution because an election had gone this way or that. That is an understanding that actually introduces the worst kind of licentiousness and abuse into the very heart of our republic, so that democracy turns on itself and becomes, instead of a basis for a stable regime that's going to have some justice to it, that participation of the people becomes the basis for a brutalizing regime that ends up in tyranny and dictatorship, which is exactly where people in the Obama faction want to take us now. So it's no accident that this issue came up in the context of Obama, because in a way I think one of the whole premises of the phenomenon that this individual represents is to sweep aside the Constitution so that we can move forward into a future in which powerful elites have no longer to regard the Constitution as a serious constraint. That's why this past week and a half or so, I wasn't surprised when, without any regard for the Congress's stated power to declare war, and therefore the requirement that they must be consulted and that their consent must be obtained before you commit the forces of the United States to offensive war. I wasn't surprised when this individual occupying the White House treated that like it didn't matter at all, and thinks that he's going to go on TV now, and having taken this dictatorial, unilateral action without regard for the Constitution, he's just going to explain it away and say, well, I did it for these reasons and you'd better accept that. Because that's not what the Constitution says. It says the representatives of the people are to be consulted and have an opportunity to disapprove or approve before such actions are taken. And the only exception recognized to that in our history was when there was an immediate threat. And Gates himself said there was no immediate threat. So you put it all together, and the contempt for the Constitution that has been accepted and reveled in by people on all parts of the spectrum who are willing to scoff at birthers and so forth has now shown itself in the form of one of the most dangerous assertions of power you can have in a society, which is when a little dictator decides that any time he pleases he can take the country into war, because we all know what war does to liberty, don't we, Stan? It creates circumstances where tyrants can use the security of the country as an excuse to trample all over our rights and liberties without regard for the Constitution, unalienable right, the will of God and justice, or anything else. And that's where they're taking us, Stan. I said it all along about the issue of eligibility. You can't treat the Constitution with contempt, especially with regard to a provision that affects eligibility for the most powerful office in the gift of the American people, and then think that you haven't undermined and destroyed the basic integrity of our allegiance to the Constitution and our respect for its authority.
Well, we may see some snapback. Now, let me ask you, Chief Davis, you have kind of your finger on the pulse of law enforcement. I know you're planning to do a show, and you talk to a lot of law enforcement people around the country. Is there not kind of an undercurrent around this country if law enforcement saying, wait a minute, we cannot allow ourselves to become the enforcers of illegality, of immorality, of unconstitutionality? Is that not out there?
Yes, it is. And officers have, for my whole career, have been always dependent upon the courts to tell us what is legal and what's not legal, whether a law that's been written is either constitutional or not constitutional. But now that the waters are very muddied, and so, and when I first was hired many years ago, officers could not be sued personally for things they did on their work capacity. That's not the same today. Officers can be sued individually for what they do. So there's many avenues here that officers are concerned about being sued, with their department being sued or them being sued personally if their judgment goes awry. And so now I'm seeing a lot of cases now where it's very muddied. One court says one thing, one court says another. The law says this, the department of regulation says that, the feds say this, the state says that. And so it's more complicated now than it ever was before, and I think it's very difficult for officers. And now we're reaching a point where officers have to really decide, hey, what do I believe? Well, what do I believe is right in my upbringings up, my growings up, my faith, my background, and how does that apply to what I'm supposed to do here today, and then what should I do about it?
Well, I think